Hey everybody, and welcome back to our second segment with James Robertson, Professor of Christian History at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto. We're talking about sort of the evolution of Christianity and Canadian culture, also hoping that even enlightens or helps you in whatever place you might be watching this video think about the evolution of Christianity within your own society. But we left off at this pivotal place in Canadian history, James, the 1960s. I mean, in all of Western culture, that was a game-changing decade. But let's talk a little bit about what happened in the 60s and how that was pivotal to maybe really reshaping the church in Canadian society and its relationship with Canadian people subsequent to that time.
Yeah, and I think most, like anybody who's even a cultural historian, recognizes that the 60s is really the late 60s. Like 1965 still feels very much like the stereotypical 1950s. Like conservative values, dad goes to work, mom stays home, 2.3 kids. It's the baby boom, right? Like, and it's good to stimulate a post-war economy. But 1967, specifically for Canada, we can look at and almost get down to the month of July as it becomes kind of that pivotal switch.
The 100th
anniversary, yeah.
Centennial year.
Yeah, and Expo 67 in Montreal, which had two very interesting Christian pavilions as well as a Jewish pavilion. But we have the basically United Church Pavilion, which had, and Gary Miedema has done great work on this in his book For Canada's Sake. And sort of looking at that United Church Pavilion, which I've always said when you look at the pictures, it would stand up with today's very postmodern sort of, this is going to sound disparaging, I don't mean so, but the kind of like hipster, artsy Canadian Christian expression. I'm like the 1967 United Church Expo would kind of, people would be like, that's cool, because it was just photographs, artwork, nothing explicitly too Christian, but telling the Christian story in art and in a non-offensive way. And then, of course, he had a more evangelical pavilion, which was a little bit more, cross across the chasm kind of thing, which is an interesting piece.
Yeah.
But really, when you look at the centenary celebrations, and when you look at the fact that churches were pretty mute on Confederation itself, but they'd been 100 years of, like you said, empire, nation building. And a large chunk of that was we were creating a distinctly Protestant, almost a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. And you have, frankly, very racist language in that, but the idea that the white Anglo-Saxon is a race especially chosen by God. Look where Canada is on the global map of the empire. It's cold here, so it's going to keep the weaker, quote unquote, races out. But we are hardy. So there's that kind of an idea. Like there's a ton of different things going on. But this, yeah, you're right. Like they've been intentional about what is Canada going to be. Dominion, that name, sea to sea, quoting the Psalms. So 1967, we've had 100 years of that, and things are going to change. Things are going to change after that. So at the King and Queen obviously come for the 100 years, and up on the dais on July 1st in Ottawa, we have a whole bunch of ministers up there. There's prayers. I think you bring this up in your book that is it after 9/11, right? Like prayer is
yeah.
But there's prayers. It's just accepted part of society. But what you also see up there too is we have a rabbi. We have Protestants. We have Catholic. We have an Orthodox priest. I'm hoping I'm getting that right. We have a rabbi, and then we have a Jewish Montreal businessman who sort of represents like a non-faith, interfaith. It's interesting. Like it's definitely it's a neat collective and almost statistically accurate of Canadian religious views.
Yeah, the service was decidedly Christian, but the dais was made up of a number of various traditions, which was almost like a signal that we were changing.
Decidedly inclusive.
Yeah.
And I need to come across it too, but in conversation with a couple of scholars, Pierre Trudeau talks about this basing it, and it's kind of interesting because he bases it on the Beatitudes, but this idea that Canada is going to be intentionally inclusive as a policy. And I think you see that with Pearson, you see that with Diefenbaker, this inclusion of immigration, which, I mean, through the 19th century, that's always been the secret, is with this much land, immigration is always, you've always seen a spike in religion when it comes to immigration. So for churches nowadays, any that are opposed to immigration, if you want to see numerical growth, you always look beyond Canada's borders. And that was intentional from 1967 on. And it's almost like evangelical or like Western European anglicized Protestantism, that's including Church of England, United Church, Church of Scotland, but also the varieties of evangelical movements, had the corner office in Canadian society. And haven't lost the corner office, they just said, okay, we're going to split the corner office into 5 parts. So you still got the corner office, it's just smaller. And I think a lot of people were reacting to that, but that was intentional. And when I talk with pastors now, I get the sense that we did something wrong. Is this a punishment? What? And I was like, this isn't. It was intentional. Like this was the 1967 on. Like this is the church in exile.
Yeah.
But it was a policy, and again, this is why I think that sort of reactive nature to policy and culture has been such a part of the Canadian church. Is didn't see it coming, but are now reacting to where the culture is. So this is now it's whether it's the railroad, whether it's whatever. We're kind of like, oh, the church is kind of toddling behind. It never really turned into the innovative cultural force that and I think you can make the argument that it definitely from the 1950s on, the Christianity of the States, very dominant in culture. Now, I would also say you can argue how effective that is as a mission thing. Like thinking of like American evangelicals and their role in politics is it's nuanced. I'll say that Canadians don't have that. Never really have. Like there's definitely involvement. I'm doing broad strokes here, but it definitely seems that's the reactive piece. Is now the culture's moved on past us. So how are we reacting to it?
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about that, because that is probably there is sort of you said that in many ways maybe the church didn't see it coming, even though the writing may have been on the wall.
Sure.
It maybe still caught us off by guard. So what's been the next piece of the church trying to play catch up on that?
Yeah, good. And it's funny too, because we have to admit the fact that from 1800 on, a huge piece of Canadian Christianity has been American evangelicalism, like from the American Methodists coming up and all the way through. Like we know that American culture is very, very influential over Canadian. Like, and the running joke Canadians are very proud of is when we go traveling internationally, we make sure to say we're Canadian, and everybody's like, okay, cool. But because we look and sound and act like Americans, we maybe don't act like it, and we don't like it. But from a certain international perspective, how do you really tell the difference between a Canadian and American? And then we get into those funny things like we're polite, we like hockey, beer, maple syrup, all those sort of stereotypes and those tropes. So I think one of the big moments, Church of England, to their credit, of course, Pierre Burton's Comfortable Pew becomes a big piece, very critical, self-critical view of what Christianity is becoming. And you see it at that point too. It's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you trying to make the pew comfortable? Like, we've got plenty of things in our society that are comfortable and make you feel kind of good and have like a social work component. But why would the church be part of that? It seems like you're actually arguing against your own identity. And I think that's true. And you'll see that in the 1980s with the bringing up of the American sort of seeker service. We have that seeker sense of, and it's kind of lowering the bar. See how cool we are? See how hip and trendy? I mean, Burton's critiques were great. It's like, you're never supposed to be cool. You're supposed to hold us accountable. Then, of course, 1967 in Quebec, the Quiet Revolution, which I like. It's delicious because you could not have a more Canadian thing of just like the Bloodless Revolution, whatever the different names are for it. And Quiet Revolution just seems to be the one that's stuck. But I mean, it's just the most polite, easygoing, complete revolution. And it's the closest thing the Canadian history has to a revolution is just in the late 1960s. I mean, the Catholic Church got cut in half, like just took the legs out. And when you think about Quebec culture, it was two pillars: French language and Catholic religion, and had been from the 1700s on. So to take one of those pillars out in basically a year is truly remarkable. But what you see is, of course, the government taking over. So, the Catholic Church ruled Quebec and ruled it like all religions do when they get all that kind of power with an iron gauntlet kind of thing. But I mean, as the government comes in and takes over education, healthcare, social networks, even being buried in sacred land becomes less so. I mean, if you want your kids baptized and therefore in society, if you want kids educated, if you want kids medically taken care of, you have to be part of the Catholic Church. So as the government sort of takes each of these pieces away, by the late 1960s, your average Quebec citizen who was like putting up with the Catholicism, saying, wait, hang on a second. I can get an education? Yeah. I can get a job? Yeah. My kids can be medically taken, yeah. All I have to do is pay some taxes. I don't really care about the sacred burial. Like, I'm out. So I get my Sunday mornings to sleep in and nothing else. And I mean, it's that great line of Canadians fight with their feet. So they don't kick and fight instead. They just walk out.
That's really what it was. It's just a departure.
That's it.
Yeah.
And I mean, if it can happen, so when I'm dealing with churches now that are largely immigrant churches that have these big numbers, but they're struggling with the kids that are either born in their native country but came here young, or born here, so what we call the 1.5, the 2, start to struggle with them of like, are they going to be involved? I'm like, well, for them it's such a huge ethnic, it's a safety thing and whatnot. I was like, but if you have young people that are trying to emulate Canadians, young people don't go to church. And I'm like, and I always tell them, if it can happen in Quebec, it can happen anywhere. Like, you have to understand, like, that was and it happened in a year. Like their numbers went from up here to like down there, and so that's when you see that happening, you're right. Like the writing on the wall, if it can happen in French Catholic Quebec, it makes sense that in Protestantism and English speaking, where it was never that dominant a force, of course it's going to happen.
So just to kind of maybe bring our conversation to a little bit of a head. Now I know that you, as historians, you like to, I've heard you say before, you like to see the world in the rearview mirror, and but you're also a citizen of the 21st century, and so where do you think when you think of the church today in Canada? How would you describe it in terms of where it's at? And what's your sense of how things may unfold, as much as you can sort of predict that or think about that? But
Crystal ball.
How would you? What's your sense?
Well, and I think the seeds for our quote unquote success lay within our Canadian culture. We are smaller. We are used to being sort of like overshadowed by a larger. If you want to look at the sort of sibling analogy, our brother is the rock star. Our brother's the star athlete. Our brother's the popular and the strong one, and we're just kind of the bookish one that stays in his room. And we're funny. We're funny, but nobody's really looking at us. And that's, it was Steve Smith, famously Red Green and whatnot, that, somebody was interviewing, like, why are so many Canadians so funny? He's like, listen, when your locker's next to the toughest guy in school, you want to make him laugh. So I was like, it's funny, and obviously it's tongue in cheek, but there's something to that. I think that the inherent sort of smallness, like we write our own stuff of like a country not considered. We know we're not big players. That's when we have Prime Minister or current Prime Minister, everybody's so excited because we have this young, good-looking guy, and all of a sudden Canadians are kind of celebrities on the world stage because we know we're not. We're overshadowed by America. But I think, if you're looking at numbers, no. What could we possibly do? The culture has moved so far beyond that it's like the catch-up game's almost kind of embarrassing at this point. It's almost like this sort of stop and like, okay, if you want to be missional, I think there's a lot of real serious theological things you got to take into consideration. Like, what is your church actually going to stand for? Because if you're making these stances, that's fine on various cultural issues and stuff like that. But recognize that is the hill you'll die on, which is fine. Again, we've all got to die somewhere at some time. So if you want to choose that and you believe that's as integral to your faith and your church, good. I actually applaud that. That's good for you. Like, you're not kowtowing to popularity. But don't call yourself missional, because you're not actually going to speak to anybody in the Canadian culture. They're not going to come back to that. So if you believe that the message of Christ still has some role in Canadian culture, then you're going to have to really look at what it is that you're saying and how it is that you're living, and maybe some people sort of start to take notice. Because I do note, so just by way of anecdote, I have a friend, and she and I just went for lunch, and we're talking about this sort of stuff. And my friend lost her father in the past year. And so struggling with that. And I was talking to her about some of these conversations, and she's like, well, like, really, what is going to happen? She's like, she's Catholic, but nominally. It's like, what really is going to happen if, the church goes anywhere, kind of? Like, is anybody really going to notice? And I just sort of looked at her, I was like, who would speak about your dad? And then I saw her eyes well up. But I didn't mean it to be like, ha-ha. But I was just like, I've done enough funerals with people that have no connection to church that they don't know what to do with death, or some of the bigger questions of our existence. And that is how you become missional, but it's definitely less doctrinally focused. And then of course immigration. Immigration is the last sort of, if you want numbers, it's going to be people coming from outside of Canada, but it'll be a stopgap for 10 years. So I think it's in celebrating the smallness of Canada, and in as always, a small collective of devout people that want to be here. The mega church model, the political model, the power model is, why would you do that in the 21st century? Power is not the way you want to go in the postmodern age, right? Power is inherently suspect. And anybody wants to be suspicious of the church. If they've never heard of Christianity before that day, but had a postmodern, mindset, if the Christian church be like, here's truth claims, and they just picked up their first history book, like, nope, there's so many stories of corruption and inner fighting, like we've talked about, that I think it has to come from this sort of smaller place of authentic stories. And actually, there's a professor at Mac that once said, and it sort of stuck with me, no matter why people are talking to you or why people show up for church, all their reasons, at the end of the day, the only question anybody ever wants to know, and if they're coming to you specifically a God thing, is like, do you know God, and what is God like? And all you can do is share your own sort of experiences with God. And I think failures and smallness and authenticity are probably the only path going forward. But we're not going to see a lot of numerical success. Maybe the next kind of couple generations coming up. It'll be experiential, mystical. Back to the Methodist, back to that sort of experiential faith.
Well, I think that one of the things that we can learn from talking history and thinking about history is history is ever evolving, and we move into new epochs in history, and we're clearly in a new epoch in Canadian history, world history even, in these days in which we live. But it's a reminder from what you've talked about, is that history is this ever-moving story, a story that's constantly being written, and now here we are in our particular time in the story, and we're in it just as they were in 1867 when Confederation was just starting, and the church had a place there. The church still has a place, it's just maybe a different place than it was
for sure.
in those days. Thanks so much, James, for giving us this big picture perspective of how the church has evolved in Canadian society. I think it's really helpful for us to think about that, as it would be in any context, whatever country we're from. As we think about what it means to live in post-Christendom, it's important that we have a sense of where we've come from and how that's contributed to where we are. So we really appreciate your time today, and thanks for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you next time on the Roundtable.